So what are we doing with the recording this morning? Just the original thing or the whole shooting box? What would you like?
What's the question?
How much of today's session would you like to be recorded and put onto live stream?
Don't know.
As much. I thought we've had enough.
You ready?
Yeah.
Yep, we're rolling.
Okay, good morning everyone. I hope you had a nice time with your object last night. And so today I'm going to focus a lot of our work through the reading, through the Foucault reading. So maybe if you can change the slide for me, Julie. The reading is one of the lectures, the fifth lecture, in the series of lectures that Foucault gave in 1970-78, so quite some time ago now. They were published finally in 2007 as Security Territory Population, which is both a spelling mistake and a peculiarly sort of unhelpful title. So in the next slide we see the various images I grabbed of the man.
Next slide, please.
Possibly giving these. I think this is the slide on the right is what it perhaps looked like in 1997. And as you see, he died in 1984. Okay, so the next slide. There's a bit of a story of him, taken from various public websites like Wikipedia and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and so on. Just for those of you who are not familiar with his career, historian of ideas, most people think of him as a philologist. What's a philologist?
A historian of words.
Yeah. I don't think there's many philologists in Australia, are there?
No, they all became linguists with the change in governmentality, yes. I think.
There's some wordsmiths up there, like there's a thing on the radio with that DA, the guy that does the cryptic crosswords.
Yes.
And somebody else who really talks. They look at the history of words and words that have been lost.
Yes.
And should be,
yeah.
They demand that they're reinstated because they describe things that can't be described any other way.
Yeah, so it goes along with genealogy, which is a sort of Foucault method.
What's the difference between that and an etymologist?
Well, I don't think etymologist was ever a profession.
Okay, it's just
whereas philologist was a big profession in Europe.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, and so he got elected to the Collège de France in 1969, and what you do there is you just give one series of lectures every year, and most of Paris turns up for them. And he was politically active. He gave a lot of lectures in America. So he was quite taken up by the Americans, unlike other French theorists, and died in 1984. So, an early and prestigious victim of AIDS. Okay, so that's just a bit of gossipy background. Next slide. I actually start on the text. So, what I've done in these slides is take quotes but I slightly paraphrase them to actually deal with what is sometimes a bad French translation, perhaps, but sometimes just the difference between French and English. So I turn them into Australian English, you might say. Okay, so in beginning, in focusing on governmentality, so what's governmentality? That's the first question he asks. And why approach the semi-obscure domain of the state and population? Okay, that's what he's looking at. He's looking at the state and population, which is not actually what we're particularly interested in. So we're slightly reading this article against the grain in this lecture, this text. Okay, the text has been designed, if you like, to attend to this semi-obscure domain of the state and the population. But we're reading it for a different reason. So it's going that way, and we're sort of trying to partly go across it. And he's looking at this semi-obscure domain through the thoroughly obscure notion of governmentality, feeble, diffuse and full of holes. Now, why does he want to use that as an analytic concept? So governmentality is an analytic concept, weak, feeble, full of holes, and in a way he's using that to interrogate this area of the state and population. Why does he want to use it? Well, he doesn't actually answer that question, which is fine, because I think it actually poses it quite nicely. Well, he answers it in a roundabout way, which we see in the next slide, that he wants to talk about the state and population by referring to other studies that he's done before. Okay, so this is studies that he's done in the past, which are on particular institutions, particular French institutions. So he wants to. So he asks, can we talk of governmentality that would be to the state? Okay, the state of its population is approached by this analytic term governmentality in the same way that techniques of segregation as an analytic was used to ask questions about psychiatry, the history of psychiatry that is done in the past. Governmentality, using governmentality as an analytic to interrogate the state and population is like using the analytic of techniques of discipline to get at penal systems, to unpack penal systems, to interrogate them. And what biopolitics, okay, equally feeble, diffuse and full of holes, many people would say, as the analytic by which medical institutions were unpacked. Okay, politics that focuses on the body, works through the body. Okay, so he's making an analogy between this bigger study that he wants to do on the population of states and asking us to understand governmentality as analogous in a way to those techniques that he's formerly worked in.
You wouldn't be able to just say a sentence on each of those three techniques?
So I'm certainly not an expert on Foucault. Maybe, does anybody else know about Foucault? Have you read a lot of Foucault?
Yes.
Right, yeah. Okay, so techniques of segregation. This is Foucault's really first study of madness. And his claim there was these contrived techniques of segregation, in other words, putting the mad in madhouses was a means of making madness as an object of knowledge.
And it had a particular historical, it points to a particular moment in time, and it sort of happened. And
so it's a particular set of modes of organising, a particular set of, or he calls them power techniques. But I think of modes when I think of techniques of separation. So it's modes of interrogation.
And was the point also that civilization became civilization by describing madness? So that they were mutually constitutive and we needed to have madness in order to be civilised?
Modern civilization, yes,
yeah.
I suppose, yeah. Techniques of discipline. Okay, so discipline is having your so techniques of discipline were to the penal system, he says here, but it's also he also talked about discipline and punish with respect to barracks and factories and schools and so on. So it's these disciplinary regimes where people were grouped in groups and they went through as cohorts so this division of populations. So you can see it's a sort of development of the techniques of segregation that he first talked about in describing how madness was made not as an object that had to be, not as a self-evident object that existed in the world, but as an object of knowledge. So it's not a found object. What he's saying is madness, you have to change your vision about what the objects are. They're not found, self-evident, for which institutions have been designed. It goes the other way around. The institutions make madness as an object of knowledge. So all these are, he's showing how it turns inside out. So it's a form of eversion. That we think madness is just out there in the world, and we think that we've designed psychiatric institutions to deal with madness, and that's a societal function. But his claim is it's not like that. For various vested interests, it turned out to be good to segregate mad people. And having segregated mad people, we constituted an institution which then, through its knowledge practices, constituted madness as an object of knowledge practices. So madness is emergent. It's not something given and found and out there. It's actually made in the workings of the institution.
And did it happen, someone I read was pointed out that it happened historically at about the time they stopped burning witches.
Yeah.
It was like, what else we're going to do with women?
Yeah. So there's someone has a interest in stopping burning and incarceration instead of incarceration. Mm-hmm. And so then this constitutes madness. Mm-hmm.
And he did that by careful analysis of historical documents.
Yeah.
So if techniques of segregation is like making madness as objects of knowledge, could techniques of discipline be making obedience or compliance as objects of production?
I suppose it is, yes. That's a nice way of putting it, yeah. Well, I think his point is that institutions go along with knowledge practices. And and those knowledge practices are generative. He pointed out the similarities between the sets of knowledge practices of prisons, barracks, factories, schools. So they're knowledge practices. So children get known in the same way as members of the military. Children get known in the same way as so it's a way of constituting subjects. So that prisoners, soldiers, factory workers, children, they're not natural given categories. They're constituted in assembled sets of knowledge practices. So the school child is an object of knowledge, not a found object. And people who are ill or illnesses are the object of knowledge of biopolitics, politics, knowledge practices that work on the body. I think your pill is a beautiful example of biopolitics. And the fact that it's coming out of the military and so on, it's a beautiful object. One that's, we might go, but okay, does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so we need to think of governmentality in that sort of a way, that it's this vague analytic concept that makes us look at government not as a found thing, but as a set of knowledge practices that constitute and are generative. And another way to look at governmentality that works for me anyway is to say that governmentality is to government as musicality is to music.
What would you say about social and sociality? I've been trying to work with this for a while.
Right, okay.
And
to put ity on the end, it is a suffix that implies state of or state of being or something. So sociality is the state of being social. So I think it's the same sort of relation. Sociality is an analytic concept, probably diffuse, vague and feeble and full of holes, but nonetheless useful because it makes you see that the social is not given, but a considerable achievement.
thank you. Penny drop, a penny just dropped for me. Good, thanks.
Yeah, I think I saw it.
Would you mind just talking a bit about how you're using the word knowledge?
Knowledge practices, yes, it's a very odd idea. So I'm using this phrase, knowledge practices, they go together. And they are, I actually showed some of them in my slides yesterday. So in the symposium talk, to constitute, if you like, the modern fact of the growth of corals. Okay? There are certain knowledge practices that go along with that, which involve putting on a rubber suit and getting scuba diving equipment and taking a piece of plastic conduit joined at the corners 1 metre by 1 metre with fishing line or string and putting it over coral. So, that's a particular set of practices. And then you take a tape measure and so on. So knowledge practices are those things you actually do when you're constituting objects of knowledge, or constituting appearances of objects of knowledge. So the growth of long-term corals is an object of, it's actually an object of governance. and there are a certain set of knowledge practices that constitute that as an object of governance. And of course, you have to go and do it every year, and so it's remade very actively with these practices. And then other practices are putting it in a computer and then putting it in a report and so on. And the knowledge practices of putting on your scuba diving stuff probably involves a bit like the sort of thing Anne does, although she doesn't go to scuba diving. You know, having stuff, manipulating stuff. But then, of course, you know, also working on a computer and going to conferences, and so they're all collective knowledge practices.
I think I keep getting tripped up because then in the end those practices are going somewhere. But you're saying really going to is something dynamic, it's not something that's fixed, like there isn't, they're not arriving at knowledge, they're not arriving at more practices, is it?
What objects? They're creating objects.
They're creating objects.
Which we're saying are kind of like
But yeah, the knowledge is not
embodiments of practices, really.
the thing that you have at the end after having done the work. The knowledge is, the knowledge is tied up in the doing. So the knowledge doesn't sit out there and we do all this stuff and then find it.
So we're not finding things that are already out there. We're constituting them. Yes. Yeah. Which is not sort of social constructivism. Of course, corals are just sitting there growing. They're doing their own thing. But they don't grow as a fact. They just grow as corals.
I'll hold that thought.
Yes.
Is the notion of a knowledge practice a Foucault notion?
It comes out of Foucault, but he didn't actually use that term.
Donna, the connections to Donna Haraway's work.
So it's actually a term that was taken over by material semiotics people from knowledge, you know, all that stuff about the knowledge economy and so on. So it was first used in that discourse. And
Its origins.
yeah, well, yeah, they're one origins, but then I think anyway, doing their own bit of philology here. Okay, so this brings us to the next slide and a note on objects. And so, and I wanted to sort of make this really clear because, and we have already, this notion of found objects, like madness being self-evidently out there as something you stub your toes against, sometimes literally, is the sort of notion of object that we're not using here. We're using object as, to mean, object of knowledge. So in giving you instructions to write about your object, what I've been doing, without saying that's what I'm doing, I've actually been giving you instructions to write about an object of knowledge, okay? Not a found object. And all of you more or less did that. Okay, so this is a quote on page 118. Analytically, well, in all those studies, in other words, the three that he's been talking about, the idea was to analytically free the exercise of relations of power from the institution. Okay, so this is part of that turning inside out and seeing the institution as generative, not dominating. So to free the exercise of the relations of power relations, from the workings of the institution. So that we don't want to see the Psychiatric Institute as having power and somehow, first of all, embedded with the power power and then going around collecting all the mad people and putting them in here. And so the incarceration of the mad people is evidence of the exercise of power. Because, I mean, this assumes that institutions are made as powerful institutions. They're found, they've been, they're sort of naturally occurring social entities that just emerged naturally to deal with the problem for society when all these things was found of madness. Okay, so that's one story about power. He wants to tell another story about power. And Foucault's telling another story about power didn't mean that that other story about power went away. It's still very present. It's still around. There's a lot of it, although there's a lot of the Foucauldian sort of power around too in these institutions. Okay, so well, I put it in red just to try and make it easier to pull things out. In all those studies, the idea was to analytically free the exercise of relations of power from the institution. In other words, institutions are not made as power, and to analyse them from the point of view of technologies. In other words, to see the exercise of relations of power as a form of technology, as a set of practices.
What does he mean by the relations of power?
The warder in a jail is powerful and the prisoner is less powerful. So that's a relation.
Is there a sense in which that it's also true, and it might come later, that just to try and lock things down in the institution means that we don't see how the institution relates to this other big thing? So you can sort of see that getting to governmentality is a sort of a logical kind of endpoint from these other analyses that he did. It's all implied in that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, I mean, in a way, Matt's story in the last collection was a story about power relations and how that's problematic for Matt. And how he needs practices, needs established protocols to be able to negotiate those practices of the relations of power.
And to analyse his engagement work, he was freeing those relations of power from the institution of the university.
Okay, so to get away from just looking at the functioning of institutions and saying, oh, that institution is functioning well, that's a bad one, and detach relations of power from the privilege of the object. That's not at all self-evident. The privilege of the object, in other words, like madness being found, like badness in prison being found, and like illness just being found entities. So, in a way, illness, badness and madness in the conventional story are the reasons we have psychiatric institutions, prisons and hospitals. The object of madness is it's always this turning inside out. This is the move that he's making. And so what he wants to do is to be able to restitute them, in other words, madness, badness and illness, in fields of power relations and as objects of knowledge, as generated in knowledge practices. And that word restitute reminded me of Anne talking about the difference between trepan and sandfish or beche de mer or sea cucumbers. And trepang is the dried, salted product, and it takes days and days to restitute it. I don't think she used the word restitute, but she almost did, into an entity that's eaten and softened up and eaten. So, in a way, the difference between madness as an object and of knowledge and madness is found, and they're both here. They're both here as different sorts of things. Is analogous to the difference between seeking a compass and treadmill. That's a very. You don't have to take that analogy if you don't want it to work for me.
Kind of a good analogy because it makes you think of the stewing nature of it there.
Yes, yes. Has to sit in water for a very long time.
Yeah, and madness is the same thing.
So, are those three stages in a methodology?
Here, in this, free the exercise of relative power from the institution and to view them as technologies, and to detach the relational power from the privilege of the object. But you could, and so what he wants to look at is madness as an object of knowledge, or knowledge practices. I mean, I should have put practices in red, as objects emergent from the workings of knowledge practices.
Right.
And
So is the creation of objects of knowledge the technologies? Is that what the technology?
no, I think he uses technologies as knowledge practices.
In the article here, he talks about the triple displacement.
Yes.
Is that the triple displacement?
Sort of, yes. I decided I'd skip that.
Do you skip it, Helen Verran?
Might have been part of his illness, not getting that quite
Yeah,
clear.
certainly a bit fluid at that
Yes.
stage.
Yes.
Again, what it makes, how you think of it in relation to this whole exercise, is that I get back to the realisation of my feeling that it was about a critic, that I was being that the institution or government was somehow, it frees me up a little bit from being negative.
Yes,
About-
being subject to the institution.
Yeah.
I don't know if I got this right because I probably came at it a bit too scientific, but I got, so the first one, he called it extra-institutional, which is a view of technologies move outside the institution and replace it with an overall point of the technology of power. So I got that as like, sometimes you get so like tunnel vision in what you're doing, and to look at sort of the wider picture and look at the history. So, you know, like the other reading, where it's come from, and so look at the bigger picture and the history and the context, and use that to really think of the problem. So I guess an example I came up with is, you know, drugs, how we look at drugs. So the problem is that, you know, they make people sick and they fuel crime, they cost a lot to fight and treat. And then people have an irrational fear that, you know, drugs is going to be the downfall of all society. But then the second thing is non-functional. He says distinguish them also from the function. Substitute the external point of view of strategies and tactics for the internal point of view of the function. So I don't know if this is right, but I take that as separating out sort of the actual and the political. So what are you trying to achieve? So what's happening now, and whether the policies and the strategies are there politically or whether they're actually doing anything. So going back to the drugs, you know, we've got this war on drugs, so billions of dollars are spent on it, but it's not actually doing anything. What it's doing is a political thing where people can say they're being tough, but it's not really doing anything. So I guess there's the political and the actual that don't really mesh up. And then number 3, non-objective, detachment from the privilege of the object, not seeking to measure institutions, practices and knowledges in terms of an already given object. So I guess I took that to be, you've got to be objective, you've got to identify your own biases and the biases of others. So, you know, everyone's got a history and we view objects regarding our own history. So you've got to be aware of those and overcome them, I guess, and then look for sort of the best solution. So not taking all the history that you've got that drugs are bad and just saying no, sort of looking at the most sensible thing, which may be just to legalise everything so you can license them and control them, which is against all the political, anything you've sort of been told or learned, but it kind of makes the most sense. So, I don't know, like, that's how I looked at it, but that's probably more of a scientific process and I don't know if it's right.
Yeah, well, if it's not how I put it, but if it's working for you, I think, you know, that's a good step along the way to really beginning this process of turning things inside out, which is, you know, not an easy set of things to begin thinking about. Yeah.
We could delve into what you noted about noticing your own biases a bit more, and Foucault takes that out of the individual person's history and into the history of societies and the kinds of knowledge that they've constituted over time. So you see that with how he talks about pastoral power at the end of the chapter, and he's saying actually governmentality comes out of this, like, really historical, going back to the Assyrians and the Babylonians.
It comes out of the sheepfold.
Yeah, so I mean, yes, it's not just individual biases, but the biases that become sedimented in time with the sort of the way in which we understand what it is to govern. And then objects are understood not just as individual biases, but your individual biases are products of this huge history of social formation over time.
So the drugs in that situation are not found objects, they're things that are actually created through technologies of power and
long cultural histories.
Yeah, because by
which in turn makes the individuals
crafting off.
It makes me think of the time when AIDS was first, or at least HIV was first apparent in, I guess in Australia, where there was then hospitals and I guess governments were wanting to make wards for HIV only, you know, and of course people with HIV were kind of like, why would you put us in a separate ward? You know, it was all about fear.
Yes. Can you say that governments, schools, hospitals, prisons are no good at dealing with a spectrum? They're no good at dealing with a linear spectrum where something at this end and something at this end, and there's something all along the way, which is what, say, people are like. They have to divide them up and say, this group's normal.
Yeah, they're into creating objects.
Yeah, this group's
so it's not a case of good or bad.
And there's a cut-off point between, because you can't handle governments and schools and prisons and hospitals can't handle complete spectrums that are gradual.
Yeah.
So they make
got to divide
categories.
Yeah, and that's what the knowledge practices do. There's a whole lot of knowledge practices that constitutes a child as failing or a school as failing, for that matter, and so on. And so we need the object.
So is that sort of the technology is how you divide up that stuff?
Yes, and the website My School is part of that technology. It's a technology of constituting schools as a knowable object.
And that what's
And we
that?
never knew schools in that way until a few years ago. We actually saw that technology constituted before our eyes. Okay, what I want to do, it's 11:15, is move on to actually introducing our objects into the room. So, in a way, it's a pause and looking at the code. We'll come back to the code later on in the day. And I thought we'll just, now I'm not sure that we'll get through this before we need a cup of tea, but I think if we just read the texts that we have with us, okay, whether they're the texts that you originally sent to me, or whether you've remade them after yesterday's work, it doesn't really matter. But I think most people's texts by this point will be a bit longer than 300 words, but please don't try and read out more than 500 words. Yeah. Okay, so I think we just go around the room and read our stories. And we will later on pause for comment. So it's really just each object getting the centre of the floor and taking a bow, basically, and we glimpse them, but we don't interact with them at this point. Okay, so we start with Sue.
The pathway. Teacher education is a fragile accomplishment. Reference Blacklock from Collier. But how can this be? Millions of dollars are channelled into it. Hundreds of thousands of teachers are in the system. They move from school to university and back to school as pre-service teachers on placement, then graduate teachers. A career in a system that has their pathway mapped upwards through standards as graduate, proficient, highly accomplished and lead teachers. These systems rely on the transportation of bodies along pathway. I'm at an airport. My pathway to the township takes me through M, then out to E. Out of the airport, then right. Down the road, past houses, kids on the side of the road, a large police station on the right. Turn left and go straight. Then down the hill and a curve. A momentary glimpse of white sand and a bright blue water. It is September. Is it always this beautiful? Then away, then left. Away from the coast, straight, then a choice to turn right. But I know I have to keep going straight. Then turning left under a tree in front of the school. I'm here, I'm at the school. I'm in a room, and this is a footnote. I'm sitting in a room with teachers, the women. I'm explaining the project. It's our first meeting and every word is painful. Every word I speak feels painful. Navigating Western and non-Western knowledge systems through such a clumsy and blunt set of language practices, mine, is excruciating. I want to put air quotes everywhere, around every word. No meaning can be assumed. No word has the meaning I mean. And there is no direct line between what I say and what I hope they will understand me to say. No guarantees. No guarantees in English. No guarantees if someone stood between us and translated my clumsy mutter. All there is in the middle, all there is the middle. And I have a very hot feeling in my guts that tells me there isn't a pathway likely to lead us anywhere close to a shared meaning. So I'm in the room. I ask about pathways, even as I know that this is the wrong question. What are the pathways that have worked for Aboriginal teachers in remote communities? A pathway is the distance between 2 points, not necessarily the shortest stretch, but now, in these times, it must be the shortest distance between 2 points. The shortest time it takes to attract, develop, recognise and retain teachers. I'm in another room, in Darwin. I pick up the phone and hear the ring, the office. I ask for X. No, she's not here. She may be in the library. No answer, she's not there. I can see the office and the library, the shortest distance between those 2 points. I can see where she is not. Thanks, I say. Thank you. I'll ring her later. I hang up. I can see the space where she is not. A pathway, 2 points, beginning and end. A line, a single, continuous, uninterrupted, seamless line. Pathways can and do exist in the absence of people, always already there. We'll decide who travels this pathway and the conditions under which they do that. A pathway carries, creates and constitutes the journey travelled on. What is the word that is other than pathway? That's the wrong question.
Okay, we'll come back to learn more about the pathway as we go along.
We start in the middle of this now because it's expanded a bit. And the object that I'm going to talk about is a print of a painting. So I'm going to talk about the painting. And we know already that the painting's by Albert Namatjira. So now I'm talking to her. Rodo, my name is Mount Sonda too. Aranda name Uruchilpa. I know that one because Albert whispered it to me when I was born. He was a quiet man, sitting there so quietly for a long time, looking at the mountain and back at me. He worked away, laying out my bones with pencil, washing me with colour, singing a little bit, washing more colour over those rocks in front of him till you'd think you could go and sit on them yourself. When he was finished, he blew on me and said my name. He told me, "You're ready, now you have to go. I have to sell you, we need the money. I've given you everything you need, you'll be all right. You'll be looked after. You can go out and do your job." There was a bit of that mountain in him, and there's a bit of it in me. That's why no matter what happens in my life, I feel good. So I ask, what was Albert thinking? What is your job? I can't tell you that. I'm a painting. I'm not him. We were close, but not that close. You'll have to spend time with me and work it out for yourself. If I just kept talking to you, I'd be like a ventriloquist doll. Your thoughts would be coming out of my mouth. That's all right, I suppose. But why don't you take a risk? Let's be quiet. Not so much talking for a change. Think of me as a flute with a mouthpiece you can blow across and hear music that's not entirely your own, that comes from you and me together. Or think of me as a choir, different voices, singing in a language you don't know, like the Ndaria Ladies Choir. You won't know the Aranda words, but you can feel them. Are they singing a hymn or a lament? A love song or a lullaby? Or step into my picture plane. Imagine you're a little Jinta, a little willy wagtail, just alighted on this rock beside where Albert sat. You're wagging your whole body back and forth, looking around. The sun's warm on your back. You're a little messenger bird. You carry messages between worlds. You pluck them out of the air like snapping up flies. You can hear Albert singing. And I say, do you always talk in metaphors? I'm trying to tell you, I'm not just a representation. You can't keep me at arm's length. It's too late for that. I'm under your skin. I'm part of your life, but I'm still myself as well. You can look at me one way today and another way tomorrow. Your feeling and memory will keep building up on me like fine dust. I'm a palimpsest. I absorb meaning and I generate it too. I'll never stop. It's what I live for. You want to understand Albert? You'll have to start with me. Any way you can. Go for it. Well, all right. If you're sure you don't mind me looking at you not so politely. Please, you're not in the National Gallery now. Relax. Forget your art history. Let your eyes go soft. That's good. Breathe. Take your time. You're in good company. Can you feel all those other people who've known us over the years? They're still here. Albert might be here too. I can hear something. This is me. I hear sort of whistling, breathing, coming from that gap in the range, and people chatting. But it's so quiet and whispery. It's creepy. Like this is kooky. Some sort of weird new agey thing, not very scholarly, is it? Oh, you researchers, you make me weak. All right, let's try a narrative. Speculative, imaginative, backed up with references, okay? I'll tell you a story about another Aranda man, old enough to be Albert's father. His name was Elkilka, and he was an artist too. And so that goes on to another story now. Let's stop there.
What was her name?
Her name is Mount Sonda or Ujupa.
We will meet her later.
output.
In every classroom, there's, as we know from the technologies of schooling, there's one naughty person who did something wrong and didn't bring her bit of paper. So can I just introduce my object verbally? Okay. My object is something you could find or think you've found and stub your toe against, because my object is a building, but it's more than the bit you can stub your toe against. It's a particular building in Ramangini, and I met it in 1999, so I've known it for a long time. It's right on the edge of town, a big, long, low building built with the idea of security in mind. Little windows, doors with big lockable cages on them, except that the people who built it weren't thinking about little tiny lithe bodies that can climb up high and get in high windows and open doors for big brothers and uncles, and so it's not completely secure. And unlike most of the buildings in Ramangini, it's got a garden in front of it, green lawns and flowering trees. And the name of the building is Resource, because about 4 decades ago it had a really, really close association. Oh, well, for the last 4 decades it's had a really, really close association with a business entity which was constituted with that building, and the building's name was, and the business's name was the Ramangini Homeland Resource Centre Aboriginal Corporation. But we always knew, and the building took on the name of the business, and we always just called it either Homelands or the Resource Centre or Resource. You know, where are you going? Oh, I'm going down to Resource. Who's that mob over there? Oh, that's Resource mob. And 10 years ago, you could go into this building and you could see Yolngu people sitting at desks with computers. You could see maybe a Yolngu woman on a broom, people walking in and out in overalls, boots, Yolngu and Ballanda sitting behind doors having meetings. There was this real atmosphere of business, that this concept of something coming in and something going out, money and people and vehicles, and that resourcefulness waxed and waned over the decade that I knew it, depending on who was the Ballanda that was employed as the CEO. And there were some real dramas and interesting things that happened in that building. And all of those stories became sort of embedded in that building. And now that entity, the Ramangini Homeland Resource Centre Aboriginal Corporation, doesn't exist, but that building that shell is still called Resource. But there's another entity, a new possible Aboriginal corporation, an object which doesn't quite yet exist, but sort of trying to exist, and it's looking for somewhere to inhabit. And this building is sitting there, and it's very attractive to that organisation. And so I'm going to explore that building as an object of governance and what influence that building might have over the shape of the new business that comes to dwell in that.
Difference.
We look more forward to hearing more on the resource. What I originally wrote changed. So this is my object in the flesh. It's a framework by which quality care and education is assessed in childcare centres and preschools prior to formal school settings across the country. Under a national quality framework. I think the object definitely is a participant in the collective of early childhood education and care. It even says in the introduction, the aim of this document is to extend and enrich learning, children's learning from birth to 5 years and through the transition to school, as if the object itself is doing that work. It's described through the metaphysical notions of belonging, being and becoming. And these words, belonging, being and becoming, are displayed in the policies and emblazoned across the walls of centres across the country. And they're now part of the lexicon of the early childhood and early childhood education and care sector. The validity of that object is also confirmed by drawing on evidence from research by neuroscientists, much to the chagrin of the early childhood educators. About a decade ago, brain research on very young children said, do you know the early years are important? True. But the amazing thing they did, the clever thing they did was, and I think later on we'll talk about how it created early childhood was vulnerable. What they did was to say to government, and unless you ensure rich early years experiences quality childcare, then you will pay the price later. So it's economically, lost my phrase. But yeah, so they made the connection between early childhood quality care as sound economic investments for the future, because we can preempt and resolve problems early on, and in fact, of course, create them. So it's saving governments money in areas of education and law and enforcement and health and so on. So the federal government responded to that by creating a national quality framework, of which this is one of many objects. It has a history further back though, that I was involved in the preceding quality system. And so this one changed partly because of that brain research and partly because the first system was failing in its assessment of quality, and it claimed to be able to assure quality. And so all of that then places me in a situation where working with Indigenous early childhood centres, mostly Indigenous staff and children, and preschools where there's non-Indigenous teachers and Indigenous teaching assistants and children, a sense are to use the same object. And I think that what being, belonging and becoming means is very different here in the north. In a short sideline, one of the outcomes of this is going to be a My Child site at my school site. It's already been established.
Well, we look forward to more, have you got a name? Frameworks.
Yeah, learning framework for Australia.
Presumably parents might have to put anything on the My Child site. No.
Or accredited or not, or
yeah, so I was quite short. So it's the intertidal loan. It's not really very good. Yeah, if you ever peered into a rock pool as a child, or walked along a sandy beach, or explored around a rocky shore to find a new hidden cove, if you've ever been fishing in the mangrove estuaries or from a shoreline boulders, stood in the shallows with a spear trap on it, prized oysters or mussels from their tight grasp, while welcome pea shells from their muddy bed. Have you ever been swimming or kayaking, capturing the coastal scene on campus or film? Then if you know it or not, you've been enjoying the intertidal zone. The space between the highest point of the sea, the highest point the sea reaches up the sand, mud or rock, and the lowest point it recedes. What a dynamic thing. How can the glistening water be captured and defined? And why should it be? What difference does it make where the land ends and the water begins?
That's as far as I got.
Right. Well, that's quite different to the previous one you wrote. It's much more drags you in, you know. The reader just emerges into it. It's lovely. Well, we'll make more of the intertidal zone. Sure.
I'll just start. Educational resources. So I started thinking about object as a measuring stick. There's a system that began as a...
Joanna, could I just ask that you take your hand down?
Oh, sorry, of course. I'm shy.
Yeah, no, but I can see this.
There's a system that began as a beneficent and accountable one. It set out to be a guiding force for the weak, impoverished, and lost. Its intention was to provide skills which would enable participation in the workforce at the time. It wanted people to do certain things and taught them how to do them. It also taught them to disregard certain things that were valuable to people themselves. It segregated people based on language, gender, class, and religion. Through the development, politicization, and this is where I got a little carried away after my Foucault reading, increasingly complex technocracies and political technologies that measure, standardize, and qualify, define, describe the governed in this system, teachers, families, and children. The segregation continued. The effort to continue to measure and count heads as they were organized led to more of these skills being transferred in the name of knowledge acquisition. Tests designed to further measure and account for the knowledge that had been acquired started to further segregate students based on the test structure. Assessment standards, setting out to be performance standards to which every student should be at by a certain time, ended up shooting students into boxes that were designed for them, or not designed for them. The assumption was that they were robots. These structures, originally designed to avoid failure, are creating it by coercively measuring and forcing people into categories that were designed with the object, not the people in mind. It's assuming that it's manifesting more failure, in fact. It's designed with the standards as defined by the object itself, assuming that the governed are all the same in culture, language, gender, class, and religion. How funny, the tools they use to segregate are ignored when setting standards to which they all must be accountable.
And it's the measuring stick. Thanks, Joe. Matt?
I just want to preface my little thing. I haven't rewritten my thing, so it's a little bit abstract. I did think of trying to write it from the point of view of the reference group, which is my object, much in the same way that Julie did that. I would have, even if I had done that, I would have done it less poetically. But anyway, in my defence, I was shopping and cooking, which is why I didn't do it.
Yes, and it was dinner.
So my object is the community reference group. Community reference groups are proliferating in the Northern Territory, constituted by governments and other organisations, i.e. they are an organisational response to something, to enable the community to participate in the development and implementation of policy and contribute to effective service provision. The extent to which they are able to participate meaningfully in the policy space varies, and I'm interested in this process. Questionable too is the extent to which the community reference group is representative of the community. I'm also interested in the notion of representation and how the constitution of community reference groups affects their ability to participate in the policy space. The move to seeing community reference groups as an answer requires investigation to uncover the question to which they are a response. On the positive side, it can be argued that they're being brought into being symbolises a recognition by governments and other organisations that there is local governance which is in place and at work within the communities that needs to be part of making things functional. I've got a whole pile of italicised words in here, which I must have thought was significant when I wrote it. On the negative side, there is the possibility that they are merely a form of window dressing, giving the appearance that there is a recognition and a desire to work together without any concomitant move to changing the dynamics of how governments engage the citizenry in practice. I'm interested in how community reference groups come to be from both organisational and community perspectives. I'm interested in the work they do, both in terms of the organisation they are constituted for and the community on whose behalf they act, and I'm interested in how they function and how their functions are negotiated and changed over time. That is my introduction.
We'll need to reach inside, I think, reference group. See his insides a bit.
Yeah, and I think that when I started, so that there's community reference groups of all different kinds all over the place, I think I'm going to need to lock down onto a particular one in order to find it.
My object of governance is financial literacy. I had been told to clear out a lot of computer files from previous research projects from the university's server. Gigabytes of notes, videos, spreadsheets, ethics applications, reports, notes and reflections associated with different projects over the years, all rather badly organised. In my cleaning work, I spotted a folder called Financial Literacy Evaluation 2008. Here are a couple of slides from a PowerPoint presentation given by a young man whose job it was back then to deliver financial literacy training for the Traditional Credit Union, a small financial organisation based in Darwin, dedicated to serving the financial needs of remote Aboriginal communities. So there were heaps of PowerPoint presentations, all basically helping Aboriginal people, or designed to help Aboriginal people to work out how to be financially literate. The evaluation, which we were asked to undertake, actually by Tess, who's going to be talking this afternoon, was being funded by the ANZ as part of its commitment to reconciliation. So the ANZ has a reconciliation policy. It considers itself to be really state-of-the-art in terms of banks' accountability. I googled financial literacy to try to find out something about its history. Every article I found treated financial literacy as already existing, fully formed, a need for people who are financially excluded, and responsibility for governments and financial institutions. In the latest version of their Indigenous Action Plan, the ANZ seems to have changed financial literacy into financial capability and inclusion. My search on the Google also, as when I looked at some papers, brought me to some old friends, Supriya and Vinita from RMIT, who are sort of money sociologists who are still working with the TCU. They essentially stopped working with us, started working with Supriya and Vinita at the Smart Services CRC at RMIT. And I happened to actually meet up with them at the hotel a couple of weeks ago, and we started talking about the way in which the Yolma were talking about financial literacy training as training in how to be like a Balanda rather than how to do our Yolma money work like we should. So after a bit of flurry there, I went back and had a look back to my job of cleaning out the folders and trying to archive all the folders of research material, and found another messy assemblage in a folder called Health Literacy. And looking at that, health literacy also seems to have been born fully formed out of nowhere, maybe at the same time as financial literacy. And so I became interested in how it came to be at around the same time that we were invited by quite different government bodies, and a bank in fact, to review both health literacy and financial literacy as objects of research gaze. So my object is financial literacy.
As a thriving found object,
Yes, although it's changed now into financial inclusion training or
Right.
something. I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's missing, isn't it, financial capability and inclusion?
Financial capability, and there's also financial citizenship, which is a Foucaultian oxymoron.
It's rather nice. Yes, Elspeth.
It's just thinking maybe ANZ should scratch the word reconciliation and put assimilation instead. Yeah, my object is actually heat stress.
It was one.
Heat stress. And so the heat stress of individuals, and in particular the practices that they use to manage their own heat stress. So really so that's the object, and then there's another actual object in a way, or technology of knowledge that comes into play, which is to help them manage their practices so they can manage their heat stress, which is a heat stress warning application for smartphones. Which is, it's a peculiar thing. So heat stress isn't really a found object in the top end. Most people would think, oh, well, that's just what it's like. We're not heat stressed. We're just adapting to a different kind of climate to what's down south. And maybe it only becomes an object because of the southern gaze, if you like, in South Australia, where they go, oh, it's hot up there. But maybe if you're from here, you don't necessarily think it's that way. So it's becoming constructed as an object of knowledge. And so the heat stress app works with other kinds of knowledge, such as the sort of weather data that comes from meteorology, with temperature, humidity, insolation, wind speed at a particular place. So it also uses your geographical location, and then ranks that against a kind of medical understanding of what thermal comfort is for the body. And as a result of that, it then tells you what kind of practices you should start to employ so that you can be more hydrated, so you can sweat more effectively, or you seek shade, so that if the humidity is too high, just drinking isn't enough, so you need to cool your body in other ways. And so it starts to have then quite disciplinary effects, because what happens as a result of this heat stress app is that it's disciplining you, it's telling you what to do as a result. And in doing that, it makes you, it responsibilises the individual, because it makes you sensitive to what you should be doing at particular times to reduce your level of exposure and risk. So that's basically it. So I feel very uncomfortable in doing this because I didn't set out to do this. I'm enrolled in this project because I have an interest in heat stress. It's actually from a completely different angle, but in seeking funding for this from government, this is something that the Department of Health, particularly Public Health, wants us to do. And so we're actually as social scientists getting involved in deepening this sort of biopolitical governance of individual bodies and responsibilising individuals not only to be normalised in the sense of being healthy, but to be normalised because the people who will be targeted by this will be people who serve particular functions for the state. So we've got, construction workers, agricultural workers, and miners as the sort of primary people that it's aimed at. So we're creating this sort of productive life that is all about like making the economy more efficient. And it's not really about, so it's being good for the individual body, but really it's about making sure those individual bodies are good for the economy. So it's really bizarre thing, particularly in the context that we're doing this for climate change. So we're making those bodies that actually produce greenhouse gas emissions more effective in the context of climate change, which they're responding to because which they've caused. So it's really ironic.
You're slightly allergic to it.
Yes.
Okay, continue.
Okay. I collapsed mine. 300 words. At the moment, I'm still an idea being called into existence by the Ramangini community, government and past failures. But one day, I think I will be a feasibility study for a Ramangini Aboriginal corporation that is being envisaged to provide services to homelands, local employment, education, training and support for businesses. It is expected that I will narrow business alternatives identify new opportunities, provide evidence of thorough investigation, and enhance the chances of success by identifying and mitigating vulnerabilities. Already, I have made Julie, Trevor and Anthea ask Norman, the IEO, about setting up a steering group and talking to Mala leaders. Usually, I end up presenting several scenarios, their implications, strengths and weaknesses on the basis of which people decide the best way forward. So that is how they had imagined and planned me. That is, until last Thursday, when they began talking to people about me, and the first person they spoke to said, "Nah, Paul, what 4 scenarios? There are lots of ways. We just want one way."
That's great. Trevor?
Okay, how do I do this? G'day there, let me introduce myself. A piece of coloured paper, coated paper, printed both sides, made of quality fibre, thank you very much. A piece of printed paper, one that's been thought about, argued over, discussed, tweaked, you name it. Not just in English either, in Yolngu too. And the versions, you wouldn't believe it, so many people had a say on what I might become. That all happened before I got squeezed through a big offset printing press in Darwin, was then sharply folded down to a nice hand size. By the way, there were hundreds and hundreds of me. Then it was off to Arnhem Land with my new workmate Trevor. He was still worried about whether I was right or not, would do the job he hoped that I had been made for. You should have seen him the first few times he shared me around. Heartbeat way up, sweaty palms, classic. I gave Trevor an excuse to do all sorts of things. I was like an intermediary to conversations, especially that awkward beginning bit. Let me just highlight a couple of moments when I thought we did our best work. I remember Trevor sticking a few of us up outside the store at Gapawiak. People stopped to have a look. They said hello to Trevor. All sorts of conversations started up. Some conversations eventually got around to what I was there for, to generate stories about cyber safety. Good times. I remember another time we went to talk to a couple of naughty boys who were hard to talk to about anything, but I allowed it to happen. Should have seen their faces though, they just wanted to be out of there.
Did they take it?
Yeah.
So now mine. A fire which would deal with the untended saltgrass plain by the river near Darwin in northeast Arnhem Land had been the subject of many conversations, sporadically happening over a period of few months. Eventually, this fire became the site of considerable tension amongst the workers in an office of an Aboriginal NGO, where I was sometimes called in to help plan and run workshops. Now, at the end of the workshop that eventually clotted from those tense conversations, I'm talking to participants to evaluate it as a teaching learning episode, for this workshop was designed to attempt to familiarise scientists with Aboriginal land management practices. Quite suddenly and disconcertingly, the source of the tension that had characterised the planning became clear, and simultaneously the seemingly unambiguous object, a land management fire, dissolved and disappeared. The object that the workers in the environmental NGO had been so careful about over all those months, negotiating Yolngu politics, technicalities, operational issues, resource implications, health and safety problems, this solid single object, which had been the focus of several grant applications, quite suddenly vaporised. In the workshop, the first fire had been lit by the right people and in the right place, according to members of the Aboriginal clan who were the instructors. But the senior landowner had done the work unobserved. But according to the scientists who were there to learn how Aboriginal landowners fired their lands, the event of the lighting should have been witnessed. They were put out. Many further mismatches in expectations occurred as the day went on. Predictably, these irritations emerged the next morning when I busy-bodied around attempting to get evaluation statements from all the participants, whether in Yolngu or in English, as participants wished, either written texts or statements to camera. But the technology of evaluation statements foregrounded something else. The irritations of outraged expectation paled into insignificance. What these statements seemed to have in common were that they all worked like a commentary on a football match. The moving ball, which constituted the game, here was the land management fire. The statement seemed to diagnose times when the ball had fizzled out of play and when and where things flowed well and what the consequences for this burning episode had been and so on. The statements, however, made it clear that in the workshop several different games were being played. A fire as something that ephemerally exists in space and time, just a single thingless spatio-temporal object, as the story of objectivity has us, and which had been so important in the grant applications, had, it seems, been actually practiced by no one.
Is there a bit on the other side?
Yes, but I'm not going to
Yeah. Just thought you might have missed it. It was a two-sided printing.
Okay, so that was all done extremely efficiently. And it's time for morning tea. And I feel full of anticipation. This is going to be a good time here. Okay, so after morning tea, we'll come back and have part 2, and then after lunch have a little part 3.
Do you know what part 2 and part 3 are going to be?
Oh, did you get the slides?
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, got it.